I'm a child of processual archaeology, literally. My father was an archaeologist, Dick Ambler, also an inspiration. That's how I learned to cut up my feet on obsidian detritus in our backyard, and how to fire clay, and how to even save our poop in the freezer for Carl Reinhardt to compare to basket maker collections. So I really grew up a child of processual archaeology. And when I went to school, graduate school, undergraduate school, to study archaeology, the study of the first Americans really was near and dear to my heart. Having worked with my dad on the Hopi reservations and Navajo reservations, I really was imbued with a respect and appreciation for Native cultures. And even before NAGPRA was passed, my dad often employed local folks on excavations and consulted with elders. And I didn't understand at the time what that meant. I didn't understand why he would always eat the goat eyeball or the eyeball of a sheep in mutton stew as a sign of appreciation and reverence. I thought it was very gross. But nonetheless, I went on studying processual archaeology. And after I got out of graduate school, I had specialized in physical anthropology, and I came to work with the State Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation in Denver. And they were conducting their NAGPRA inventories. That is a listing of all the human remains and associated funerary objects in their collections. And they needed someone to help analyze them. And it just so happened that I had a background in physical anthropology. And so I embarked on a path that has changed my career forever. And it hasn't been an easy path. One of my heroes, Pema Chodron, advises us to go to the places that scare you. And I've been doing that for a long time. And this was an area that was really scary. When NAGPRA was passed, I knew nothing about the law. I knew nothing about working with tribes under the law. And in fact, as a physical anthropologist, I really felt that we were going to lose everything. However, I started training under Roger Echohawk when I first started. He's a Pawnee scholar who has looked at connections with Pawnee oral histories in deep time. And I started thinking about things a little differently. And most importantly, as Peggy has advised us, as Trelore just said, I started listening. So some of my baggage as an archaeologist and now as a museum curator really comes from the origin of museums in Western culture. And it used to be that museums were really nothing more than cabinets of curiosity, where those with the means to do so could collect objects, go on expeditions, and come home and impress their friends. In fact, it wasn't that long ago at the turn of the century that if you were anybody of any means, you would go off to Egypt, bring home a mummy, you would invite your friends into your foyer, and you would have a mummy unwrapping party. And this is just what people with means did at the time. Importantly, the roots of the modern museum can also be traced back to this elitism. Those who had the knowledge, those who had education, typically had a lot more means than the rest of folks. So, I like to think about how scholarship informs NAGPRA. I'm kind of a woman without a country. When I started doing NAGPRA, I would go talk to our Native American consultants, and here I was at the time, a young woman who studied bones, and I was non-Indian, and what in the hell did I know? To my brethren archaeologists, I was a turncoat. So I started thinking about how we look at the past, how scholarship explores the past. And as I said before, it's often belonged to experts, people who knew more than anybody else about a certain subject. We've often the academy has often looked at the past as a strict chronology with a set of facts and times that are independent of the cultures that actually live within it. Now, passed in 1990, NAGPRA is a law that is different things to different people. Some people see it as cultural rights law. Some see it as property law. But regardless of one's interpretation of the law, what it did do was forced scholars, museum people, archaeologists, and tribes to the same table to discuss some of these difficult issues. And I do recognize these are difficult issues, and there are many interpretations. And I'm just going to share with you today some of my own points of view based on my experience. As I worked with the Historical Society, in the mid-90s, I became the NAGPRA liaison with the state of Colorado, working with the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs and the State Historical Society, and then eventually the NAGPRA coordinator after that. So much of my experience I'll be drawing from and sharing with you today that has been garnered over those last 20 years. So I want to give a quick overview for those of you who might not be familiar with NAGPRA. And just to let you know, I'll be concentrating on the museum side of things. I'll explain the difference in a minute. But who has standing? Lineal descendants. You can show that you're directly descended from someone, federally recognized Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations. So there are two parts of NAGPRA. So there's a part that deals with discoveries of human remains and associated funerary objects on federal lands. And there's this other part that I will be talking about today, which focuses on human remains, associated funerary objects, unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and items of cultural patrimony in museums. That's a mouthful. I'll go into what those mean in a minute. Museums were required to, by 95, send inventories of all the human remains and associated funerary objects in their collections to the National Park Service, and also to compile lists of other items that they have in their collections. So of that museum provision, there's a subpart B and a subpart C. So one side deals with those collections after 1990, and one side deals with those collections before 1990. Now, interestingly, Treloar was saying before, we found we were out of compliance. And if you saw her wince, that was because non-compliance can carry big civil penalties for museums. And it's a situation that museums don't often like to be in because it can be rather uncomfortable and expensive. And against the law. As a matter of fact, the state of Colorado permanently funded the NAGPRA liaison position when they found out the cost of civil penalties and what that could imply for non-compliance had they not been carrying out NAGPRA at the State Museum. So what does NAGPRA require of your museum? If you have human remains or objects in your collection, then most museums have already completed these summaries that I referred to and made an inventory listing by 1995. What I really want to talk to you about, the law is by no means a perfect law. The law can be a cumbersome law, but there are some aspects to this law that I think have actually improved scholarship and the way we know the past. And that's what I'd really like to concentrate on today. Part of the reason is that I believe it's improved our scholarship is that consultation is a cornerstone of the law. So basically having a dialogue with descendants, having a dialogue with tribes. And through that consultation, that dialogue, talking and listening, you really learn a lot. Here are some consulting tribes at the BLM Anasazi Heritage Center in 2010. By the way, the state of Colorado recognizes 49 tribes as having indigenous ties to this state. And that is derived through a variety of means. And each state is different, each organization is different, each agency is different. So that is part of the imperfection of NAGPRA, if you will, is that each organization and agency is required to interpret the law to the best of their abilities, which includes who to consult with. What are the consultation requirements for a museum? Well, you have to speak to the lineal descendants that might be related to objects in your collection. You have to seek consultation with legitimate tribal officials that recognized, elected, and religious leaders that either own the land that the objects came from, that are likely to be culturally affiliated, and that have Aboriginal lands from which the items originated. Here's an example of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma during tribal consultations at the Sam Noble Museum. You know, we found out when we first started doing these consultations, we've had a variety of consultations. We've had collections reviews. I've been involved in symposia where we're actually gathering evidence from different scholars, including tribal scholars, one-on-one consultations, group consultations. So there is no one answer here. It's really going to depend on the collection and where you are as a museum and who the tribes might be that you're going to be talking to. So again, with an authorized tribal delegate, and it's very important that museums talk before the tribal consultation to work out the agenda and other components of that consultation. These are some of the nuts and bolts of what I've found helpful in developing such consultations. But suffice it to say that logistics can make or break a consultation. Providing information about lodging and where the bathrooms are just as important as some of the other meatier issues. And one thing I would like to stress that our hosts here have taken to heart is that food really breaks down barriers. I work for the federal government. I work for the Bureau of Land Management. We are not allowed to spend any money on food. So we have potlucks. We just had our tribal consultation last month, and I made enchiladas for 50. And, there's something about coming together and breaking bread and sharing in the food that really helps break down barriers, too. I wanted to add that consultation is a process and not a destination. A lot of folks think, well, I sent a letter and I didn't hear anything back, so we've consulted, right? Not right. I mean, consultation, real good consultation, means sitting down as human beings, as individuals, and having a conversation. You'll see here, this is Jacob Winona. He's from the Nome Eskimo community, and he's looking here at some hunting objects related to his community. And this elder was, and you'll see me there on the right, frantically taking notes about everything he's saying. Those notes are then included in the database about those objects. And he's giving me information about how the objects are made. He's also talking about global warming and how the sea is retreating that they're having to go farther and farther to hunt seals, and how just in his lifetime things have changed so much for his community. all that information we're taking down as we're going through the consultation. You know, as practitioners who study the past, sometimes as archaeologists, we've become unfamiliar with talking to live people about the past. When I was in graduate school, I never had a single class that would prepare me for talking to live people, except, say, a couple of our anthropology classes, applied anthropology. And I have to say, NAGPRA is here to stay, and we are doing a disservice to our young people if we do not allow them to start at least observing how to take part in consultations, to engage with tribes, and to start breaking down the barriers by seeing us archaeologists and them Indians. If we can start breaking down those barriers to integrate the different ways of knowing the past. So I talked a little bit about cultural affiliation determinations, and I spoke before about lineal descendants. Here's a case in point, Ernie LaPointe, who is the great-grandson of Lakota Chief Sitting Bull. And I also wanted to mention that there's tribal affiliation. Here you'll see the Jemez tribal members carrying their loved ones for reburial back at Jemez Pueblo in 1999. So what is cultural affiliation? Now here's the sticky wicket. This is where we really get into deep, muddy waters, because the law outlines what cultural affiliation says. There's been different court decisions about what cultural affiliation says. There are different agency determinations about cultural affiliation. There are different tribal perspectives about what cultural affiliation is. The one thing I can tell you is that cultural affiliation does not apply to a pan-Indian group. There are over 500 recognized tribes in the United States. There are different linguistic groups, there are different cultural groups, and you can't always tell just by material culture. For example, we had some hoopah baskets at the Historical Society that looked, for all intensive purposes, just like Yakima baskets. Well, now these are two neighboring tribes who have nearly identical material culture, and they have entirely different language groups. But they share in potlatches, they share in exchanges. But what I'm telling you is that it's complicated. It's really complicated. Here is the legal definition of what cultural affiliation is under NAGPRA. You'll notice that the regulations refer to tribe and not tribes. And Judge Gelderks has determined that that the definition needs to be a one-to-one relationship. So without getting into that, there are people in the room who know much more about that than I do. I will just say that as we continue the law and its interpretation may change as well. Another aspect of the law is, of course, this is pretty self-explanatory, human remains and associated funerary objects. A lot of times what we end up with in every museum I've worked at are unassociated funerary objects. And the reason is because collectors often go after burials because that's where you find, unfortunately, some of the nicest materials. So museums are flooded with collections that we know originally came from a burial one way or the other, but that remain that was deliberately placed with that person as part of his death right or her death right has become disassociated from that person and thus becomes an unassociated funerary object. I'll glimmer over this, except to say that notices of inventory completion for human remains are evidence-driven. And the difference between human remains and associated funerary objects is they follow one line of the law that requires that the museum and the agency provide evidence to make a determination of cultural affiliation. Unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and items of cultural patrimony are claim-driven. And that's an important distinction because in the case of those objects, the burden of proof is upon tribes to bring that forward to museums in order to make a successful claim. So what is the evidence? Here are the lines of evidence that NAGPRA recognizes as valid lines of evidence. And what I think also has been really great about NAGPRA, in my opinion, is that considering these lines of evidence has helped me as an archaeologist and as a curator to think about the past in a more synthetic way. To look at, okay, we're making some assumptions about how these people are related. Do the linguistics support that? Does the folklore support that? And importantly, you'll also see up here oral tradition. And that's really important because in any other line of law, this would be considered hearsay. NAGPRA specifically recognizes oral tradition as a valid line of evidence. And you know, that's really important for us as archaeologists when we're looking into the past, even when it's the deep past, to consider that Native peoples really rely on oral traditions. Binford demonstrated that beautifully with the Nunavut, that knowing where certain sources are, even if you've never been to that source in your lifetime, could save your life. Knowing the stories, who you are, where you come from, is a very important part of your identity. And many of these stories, if you will, have been passed on over millennia. So unassociated funerary objects, I told you before what those were. I have an example here that I find fascinating, and it gets to the grist of how complicated this can be. These are objects from Forbes Cave in Hawaii. They were originally taken out of the cave in 1905. And the cave also included human remains in the cave. And they were sold to the Bishop Museum and bought by Charles Reed to honor his late wife, Princess Bernice Pauahi Bishop, the last descendants of the royal Kamehameha family. And after the NAGPRA was passed, the museum loaned objects to Wimalana Inakapuna Ohuaine, which was a Native Hawaiian group. In 2000, they loaned these. Well, the group ended up reburying these objects and sealing it under concrete in Forbes Cave. However, there are other Native Hawaiian organizations who objected to this. And as a matter of fact, one of those was the Royal Hawaiian Academy that include members of the Kamehameha family. And in 2005, the Royal Hawaiian Academy sued the Bishop Museum for loaning those objects and eventually won that lawsuit, and the Bishop Museum and Wimalama had to pay nearly $400,000 in restitution to the claimants and to return those artifacts to the museum. Now, Wimalama had claimed that those were funerary objects, and that's why they had done what they had done. Whereas the Royal Hawaiian Academy, also of party of standing, contested that. So you start getting a sense, right, of how gritty this can be. So sacred objects, a lot of times we as archaeologists aren't necessarily, or museum curators, we're not necessarily going to know what a sacred object is. Have any of you guys ever read that Motel of the Mysteries, and you see the toilet paper with the toilet seat with the paper covering, and it's a ceremonial headdress from, archaeologists of the future say that's a ceremonial headdress. And the joke with archaeologists is always, if we don't know what it is, then it's ceremonial. Well, under Under NAGPRA, sacred objects are really narrowly defined. They have to be used in an ongoing ceremony, and you have to be able to demonstrate that is the case. This is a great example of a sacred object. It's a wampum belt that was repatriated, and as a gesture of appreciation, the Cayuga Museum of History was presented with a replica by the Haudenosaunee, I'm not pronouncing that right, Confederacy. And so they have a replica of the original in their museum that they're still able to display. Then there are objects of cultural patrimony. A great example of an object of cultural patrimony for us would be the Liberty Bell. It's something that a whole group owns, that is inalienable from that group. No one single individual can own it. Here is a raven headdress that was repatriated on behalf of the Great Central Council of Tlingit and Haida tribes in Alaska. This was a celebration that was promoted by the tribe itself. I won't be using any images in this that are not for fair use to distribute and share. But this is something that the tribe itself really celebrated. And I want to bring up something else with this headdress that we'll touch on later. One of the problems with museum collections is that, especially early on in this century, museums thought it was a great idea to just fumigate the heck out of everything with, the nastiest pesticides we could find, and a lot of those contain arsenic. So tribes these days are really facing a challenge with items like this, like a headdress that would be worn close to the skin, that might be repatriated. Of course, arsenic and other heavy metals do absorb through the skin, so it's a growing concern for tribes. So how long do museums have to comply with NAGPRA? Basically, as long as you have Native American collections, a museum will be required to comply with the law. Now that said, now that I've set the doom and gloom upon you, I want to paint a little rosier picture of what NAGPRA has done for us as a museums in this country, and the possible benefits that can come out of it. This is one of my favorite circular stories. Here's Myron Gonzalez from the Pueblo of San Ildefonso. He's with a turkey feather blanket here that his mother told me, "You've just got to hold this." And it's light, and just within moments of holding this blanket, you become warm. And you find these blankets with virtually every burial in the American Southwest. This blanket is about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, and includes the breast feathers of over 400 turkeys. Those turkey feathers are wrapped over a yucca string, and then that string is looped back and forth and then woven together to form the blanket. Now, those we find in the archaeological record are really big. So it took him almost 6 months working with the San Ildefonso youth group to make this for our exhibit. So it gives you an idea of how labor intensive they could be. Now, the very interesting part of this story is Myron learned how to make this blanket from an archaeologist. Eric Blindman had excavated these blankets like this and learned about this technology and replicated the technology, and then gave this technology back to San Ildefonso. So part of this compliance is also about building trust relationships. Here is a medicine shield belonging to the Crow Nation at the Colorado Historical Society. And you can see the medicine at the top. Can you see that ball, the beaded red ball at the top? And on either side of that beaded red ball are 2 other little balls. And those contain what is called medicine. It might be herbs or other items that are used on this shield. It's someone's personal shield But it's not a war shield. It's used for ceremonial purposes. It would have been used by someone, a practitioner, the likes of which Peggy Jodrey referred to earlier. The Crow Nation wanted us to hang on to this shield for safekeeping, but they had some very strict care and handling instructions for us for this shield. One of them was that menstruating women not handle the shield. That's a very common instruction. However, for the past 22 years, I've worked in museums with almost entirely female staff. So oftentimes, that can't be accommodated. In addition, I was pregnant for one of those times. Pregnant women aren't supposed to be working with human remains, and yet that was my job. So we ask for accommodations. What can we do to accommodate your desires and wishes? If a woman has to handle this, what can we do? And so we were instructed in certain ways to take the shield off the shelf in a counterclockwise direction 4 times, and some things to keep in your head to keep yourself safe. And ironically, in almost every case that I've come across for special handling considerations, it wasn't for the object's safety, it's for the people's safety that are handling those objects, which I find really interesting. Anyway, we were able to develop some care and handling procedures with bright yellow cards that tell us, hey, pay attention. There's some procedures here that you have to pay attention to before you handle this object. And sometimes consultation yields information about collections that you never would have imagined. This is a plated yucca pillow from Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde. We thought it was something amazing because there are only 2 of these, and when we consulted with Hopi and other pueblos, they said it's a really elaborate sleeping pillow. And so we said, great, it's cool though. So, you know, and recently we had the pueblos to consult, and we have some stone, they're about this big, and they're shaped kind of roughly like those nesting Russian dolls, and they're called toponis. And we've been keeping the toponis away because someone on our staff had heard years ago that they're never to be touched, they have to be put away, and we had the pueblos there, and they said, these toponis are representations of the corn mother. People are given the toponi when they're born, and those toponis follow them for the rest of their life. They shouldn't be put away. They need to be in the sun. They're protectors. They need the light. They're the women. They're the women in our society that protect everyone else. And for God's sakes, don't keep them in the dark. And so as museum collections managers, we figured we'd been doing this wrong all these years with the best of intentions, but nonetheless, there's something about that one-to-one conversation and just learning more about it that helps us to overcome some of those assumptions. Well, some of you might recognize this item. We saw something like it, but really cool and a lot older from Dr. Soleil yesterday. This is what we call a cloud blower. And this is a stone cloud blower. And all this time, I've been interpreting cloud blowers to be pipes, as Dr. Soleil said. And it was interesting. We've had consultations and have now heard from the Hickory Apache Nation, the Southern Ute Indian tribe, and the Pueblo of San Ildefonso that these are actually used in their tribes for healing ceremonies, where the healer places the large end on the afflicted area of the person that is ill and sucks out the illness. And they equate it to cupping, as was done in modern times, and sometimes those can even be heated to add to the ceremony. So when Dr. Soleil had his tubular sandstone concretion yesterday, I was very excited and wanted to tell him, hey, we've heard very similar things. You know, and consulting with people can tell you a lot about what you have. Here's Howling Wolf's ledger depicting the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. And if there's one thing I have learned about consulting with tribal delegates is that what we consider long ago history, which would be ironic for a group of Paleo-Indian enthusiasts, these memories are alive and well for many tribal members. The assimilation area, forced removal, the U.S. Indian Wars are not long ago memories for folks. These are family stories. It happened to people that they were related to. Sand Creek is no exception. Here in Colorado, it's a deep and painful memory that lives on for many American Indian people. Here's another, it's a terrible picture, but if you can see, there are butterfly-looking images on here. This is a Mesa Verde black and white bowl, and you'll see the linear designs, and there's some tick marks on the surface. And some folks are now saying, and I think it's Scott Ortman has come up with some amazing analogs, that a lot of designs on Pueblo pottery are really metaphors for other things. So for example, tick marks on the edges of pots might harken back to baskets, and that bowls may have metaphorical meaning associated with women, whereas bowls, for example, the top of a kiva is a metaphor for males. And then we had Pueblo consultants coming in, and they were talking to us about linear lines being metaphors for corn and rows and agriculture. And then you have step lines that can be metaphored for thunder and the rain. And then there's the butterfly-looking design that can be a metaphor for Corn Mother, the one who brings us everything and makes it all happen, makes life happen. And all of a sudden, I go into my collections, and instead of seeing collections anymore, I just see metaphors everywhere. And it's really changed the way I view collections, because material culture, we are deconstructive. We break things down into their smallest parts, and we go, okay, that looks like this, and this looks like that, and this is how we put it together. Well, in Pueblo culture, that's not how it's put together. You're singing a song while you're making this. You're putting your intentions into the pot, and you have a plan for how that pot is going to be made. And the design elements might come from a dream, they might come from your mother, or they might come for the purpose of that pot. And I don't think it's so far-fetched to take those metaphors into a lot of what we see into the archaeological record, even if we don't understand it. There is a deeper meaning, cosmological, if you will, but these people's lives, the stories, were made survival possible. And paying homage to that was part of daily life. And it wasn't just hooty-hoo, witchcraft. This was really part of walking the walk every day. And usually when you talk to practitioners, that's what you find. Collaborations have yielded some really incredible and amazing results. As I mentioned before, tribes are really concerned about repatriating objects that have been subjected to pesticides. And this is a great project where the Getty was actually training members of the Hopi tribe to identify arsenic in collections. So they're going through this very training to prevent that to identify those kinds of objects. This is a really interesting collaboration. This is a meteorite that was originally found, and I will say the name wrong, Tomanowos. If anyone knows how to say that, I'd appreciate it. It's a Willamette meteorite that was found 110 years ago near Willamette Falls, and has been stored in the American Museum of Natural History. Now, interestingly enough, the Native people in the area talk about this being a sacred object, a very special object. In fact, young warriors would visit Tomanoos, which is its name. This is alive. It is an alive being, and they would visit him and dip their arrows in the water collected in those vessels, and to get spirit power for puberty rites. So the museum, once a year, they have a pilgrimage to visit and to do those rites, and then, it's a great collaboration, I think. You know, part of working with tribes is also really developing trust relationships, and this is one of many people who have really generously shared knowledge with me. This is LaForce Lone Bear. He was the great-grandson of White Antelope, who was killed at the Sand Creek Massacre. LaForce still carries the song, or still did carry the song of White Antelope. So I started talking to him because we had a large Cheyenne collection, and I wanted to know more. And he said, if you want to know more, you need to come up to Lame Deer and talk to me. So I did. I went with my colleague, who's Pawnee and Creek from the Commission of Indian Affairs, and we took the kids. We went up to Lame Deer. The truck broke down, and it was the best thing that ever could have happened because Mr. Lone Bear took me around, and he took me to where Sitting Bull sat and meditated before Wounded Knee. And he took me to the special places in Lame Deer and taught me, if you're serious, if you're sincere about wanting to learn about the Cheyenne people, this is what you know. And I did have some things happen. We were repatriating a scalp block, and something happened. And I never shared it with them. And he said, you need to come in here with us and be a part of this because you need to be healed from this too. And he was a very special mentor of mine who passed away a couple of years ago. Anyway, he created this eagle staff for runners during the Sand Creek Massacre. And again, it was a live object. It was meant to deteriorate. That's something that we as museum people don't get. Some things are meant to be used. They're meant to deteriorate. They're meant to get damaged and dusty. And this was a perfect example. Every year it would come back to us a little more torn, a little more beaten, and that was a good sign that it had been used well. Another example, this is a collaboration with Kiowa elder John M. Hula, refreshing the Standing Bears teepee. John M. Hula came from a great family of teepee makers. Mostly the women make them, but he knew his stuff, and he's helping them directly there. This is a Zuni clay pot, and you know what's interesting about this is that you'll see a fetish. We talked earlier, we call these fetishes. You can see a frog, and there's a critter there, I think a salamander. I remember showing somebody a Zuni pot like this with the tadpoles and talking about how they're often used for fertility ceremonies, and they said, but how did the Zuni knew what sperm looked like? And I said, no, those are not sperm. They're tadpoles. They're signs of the rain coming. Those are little frogs about to become big frogs. Again, in having those conversations, it helps us to learn more about our collection. Community involvement really changes museum, and I don't care if you're talking about tribal involvement or the Chamber of Commerce. Involving your community, what you do as a museum, helps you do it better. Here is a picture of the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian. It was a huge celebration. That was national news. And I remember being in Denver. It was just a buzz in the Native community, just a sense of pride that it would be opening. These partnerships can foster some cross-cultural understanding. In fact, we partnered with the American Genocide Foundation to have a panel about what genocide meant. from both Jewish perspectives as well as, or Holocaust perspectives, as well as American Indian perspectives. And by the way, the target audience were American Indian students from the local Denver community. From that, I challenge you, what is your community connection? You know, Fort Collins is the ancestral home of the Northern Arapaho, the Southern Arapaho, the Northern Cheyenne, Southern Cheyenne, some of the Ute bands, the Pawnee were through here. And then, of course, we have earlier connections with Paleo Indians and folks that we haven't even really figured out those connections, and our rich ranching history. And so from all that, I would just ask each of you to explore for yourself what this sense of place means for you, and to consider that it might mean something different, something else to some of our tribal delegates, tribal folks that have lived here for so long. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. It's my honor to be here. I'm Cheryl Donaldson. I'm the executive director of the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery. And I was hired on, as Trelaura alluded, in 1998 as the curator of collections at the Fort Collins Museum, a museum that had been in existence since 1941. And I knew walking in that the museum hadn't been in compliance with NAGPRA, which was an opportunity, is how I viewed that. Certainly can be an embarrassment, but honestly was an opportunity for us to have a dialogue. You'll see in my presentation, I don't have any pictures of objects. All the things that Bridget talked about as far as finding out connections that we didn't know about with different objects through consultation happened as well. But really, our story is about relationships. We had 19 individual human remains, Native American human remains, that needed to be consulted and decided upon what was going to be done. And we did that through some unique avenues. First thing I did when I got on board was figure out who I needed to talk to, both from the tribal communities and also from the experts in the region. And Bridget was clearly one that I had reached out to and had given me all sorts of great guidance to move forward. We also consulted with a woman who lived here. Her name is Dr. Brenda Martin, who had done some tribal consultations with museums, specifically with NAGPRA. Huge gift. And what I'm going to talk about today was mostly spearheaded by Brenda and her amazing work with the tribes. Our approach, I don't know any different. I've not done consultation with tribes at any of the other museums that I've worked at. So when I have been approached by museums or tribes saying, you know, you guys did it right, my comment back to them is, we did it, and we hope to have done it well, but we did it by listening. I am not an expert in archaeology, anthropology. My background is material culture, loosely, and mostly just museum studies. So for me, it was really about listening and responding and really dealing with it on a human-to-human relationship. So what you see here is the photo of the people that were involved in our first consultation. We had over 11 tribes. We had culturally unidentified human remains. We had 11 tribes come to the table over 3 days in 2002 to discuss who would be taking the lead on the repatriation, the claim for repatriation for these individuals. And we did not, I mean, as I said, we listened. I learned from that experience that there were tribes sitting around our table who are traditionally warring tribes who still do not get along, who were able to come together and have a conversation about what was right in managing the repatriation of these specific individuals. They came to an agreement, and I'm looking at this because it's an agreement of understanding of joint identity claim by all 11 tribes, that the Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho of Oklahoma would take the lead on repatriating. That was a monumental event. I believe it was probably the first time, at least in our region, that we had come to an agreement with that many tribes and getting that much consensus. So that was a real honor to be a part of that. But what was more of an honor is to be able to meet these individuals and who had a part in this activity. After this picture was taken, one of our Native friends here in Fort Collins, John Gozen Center, and his wife and family opened up their house for a feast and for a sweat for both museum staff and tribal elders to participate in. And again, that goes back to the building of trust and honoring tradition and understanding that certain ceremonies needed to happen soon and immediately after this, and we were able to do that. And that was my first exposure to the, whoops. This is a photograph of our second, the resulting repatriation of our second consultation. You have Joe Big Medicine, who is with the Southern Cheyenne, and he was their NAGPRA representative that worked with us through this process. We also are missing a dear friend of mine who died in 2006 prior to this repatriation, Lee Pedro. Lee is the father of the child that Trelor alluded to that had identified or asked her if she was a ghost. Nobody knows that story, but it's a fun one to play with. The cemetery marking is there to honor those two burials and the work that was done by Lee. And that marking is at Roselawn, that is still there, obviously, today. And that repatriation was done in 2006. Again, food's important. Everything that we do with our tribal consultants and our Native advisory group has a food component to it. This was a potluck that we pulled together, similar to what Bridget was talking about. And what these conversations really did is that we had opportunities with our Native advisory group folks and our tribal consultants to talk about what it is and what makes Fort Collins unique and what we need to do moving forward. One of the things that when I came on board, I witnessed a second grade tour happening, and one of the second graders was asking the docent at the museum who was talking about, I can't remember the exact details, but basically this young child implied that there are still no living natives, no Indians left. And that was disturbing because we do have a good Native population here in Fort Collins that needed to be engaged and needed to be part of who we are and have that conversation. So what we do as a museum is we get the great privilege of telling stories. And we don't tell them, we ask those people who have those stories to tell them for us. We get to be the convener and the venue in which that happens. So what we did, we took NAGPRA beyond just the compliance of the law. We did consultation, and this is a photograph of the contingency from Southern Cheyenne, and Clifford Duncan is the gentleman in the white cap. Brenda Martin is the woman in the middle, and Dalen Figgs, as you can see, is over in that picture too. We were able to take different groups of folks out to Soapstone and Red Mountain, and they were able to tell us stories that they had through oral tradition of that landscape. And by looking at the landscape, tell us stories that we may or may not have known through the archaeological record or not. That information was used by applying it to the management plan that the city put together for managing Soapstone. So here is a good example of how we went out to the landscape with numerous tribes. We probably did 5 or 6 of these with different folks and gathered information, listened, and then we're able to bring that back to the table to say, this is what we heard, this is what was said, and this is how these folks would like to move forward. Now, there wasn't always consensus, and that is sometimes the frustrating part of developing these management plans or looking at making definitive statements. but you can get kernels of wisdom in this. So what does that mean for Fort Collins? I mean, obviously, Soapstone, Lindenmeier, Red Mountain, our open spaces are very important to us. But culturally, what does that mean? So we went back and talked to our advisors and said, hey, what do we do? What do we do that can convey to the community that we have a native population who's engaged and has a cultural story to tell? Well, they came back and said music. Music is how we communicate, how we want to be represented. And we said, great, now help us. And so in 2003, we did our first Native American music festival. It was actually called Crossroads to the Council Tree. And the young man in the yellow shirt over there is Will Gozen Center, who I'm sure is now a grown adult. But his father, again, John, was one of our consultants. And they all jumped in with both feet to make these festivals very successful. About the same time, we were asked to participate in a symposium at the American Alliance of Museums to talk about how we were engaging our Native community and consulting with tribes. And taking information and making it relevant for not only our museum, but the community. And so in 2003, Brenda and I had the privilege of presenting our work alongside the Field Museum and Gordon Yellowman and what they were doing on a much larger scale, because obviously here we're still the Fort Collins Museum, a fairly small museum. But this really speaks volumes of how we work in developing relationships and in developing programs. We have a traditional and a contemporary view of Native culture. That was an important part of what we did. So you see traditional dancers. I think that's Kevin Locke on the bottom photograph, and then of course the circle dance. And then we also took it to schools. This is what Trelaw was talking about when she had the privilege of taking Kevin Locke out to, I think this was Irish Elementary School. And we did this with each of our annual programs, is have a school element. And so what he would do would be tell traditional Lakota stories and engage the students to participate in dancing. The guy in the regalia behind Kevin Locke, I only know him as Doug from Denver. But was an amazing dancer who traveled with Kevin all over the country. Oops. Music and art go hand in hand. That first music festival that we did in 2003, we also highlighted an exhibit from Sam English. Sam is a native artist out of Albuquerque, and we had him here for the opening in conjunction with the music festival. This happens to be the work of Bunky Echohawk. I think most of you recognize the Echohawk last name. He integrated rap and his artwork, so he actually painted while his band was playing that evening, and then produced that painting, which we have in our collection today. Again, more pictures of the music festival. Again, we have food. We provided food for our vendors and our musicians. Lance Allrunner has been emceed that first year for us, and Carrie Morin, who is a local talent here in Fort Collins, was part of the Atoll, and his mother, Anita Morin, who is an elder for the Crow, live here locally and have been a huge resource. That morphed into a larger market that we had in Old Town. So we moved it from our location over at the park, Library Park, to Old Town during the weekend of CSU graduation. So we could have a higher exposure with the vendors and also continued the music as we did in previous years. This is the lower picture is a picture of Ty Smith, who is the director of the Native American Student Services, which I think now they call it the Cultural Center, and the CSU drummers. We always had a drummer, and we always have a drummer at these types of events. And where do we take it from here? We talk about we need to gather the more Native input on the Lindenmeier story, as well as a lot of other stories here locally. We had to take a bit of a hiatus because we built a new museum, which I'm sure most of you know, and so we haven't been engaging with our Native advisors as much as I'd like to, and I'm really looking forward to moving forward. I am happy to say that we had our final human remain individual repatriation in 2013, which, if you look at the time frame from 2002, when we began the discussions, to 2013, I think that's a testament of how long this process of NAGPRA can be, but it's very important that you do gather that input. I'm going to play part of a film that we produced in 2009, resulting from some of these consultations that we did, specifically about soapstone. The entire film can be seen on our website, along with another film that we produced in, I think it was 2006, that talks about the oral, it's the oral histories of soapstone, which includes the rancher stories and the Native story as well. Now let's see if this technology will work.
As a Native American, we recognize that for generations and generations, that this is where we came from, our people. This is where my forefathers were. This is where they talked about sacredness.
People have called the prairies and foothills of northern Colorado home for more than 12,000 years. The Lindenmeier archaeological site bears witness to the Folsom Point makers and bead carvers who looked out over this landscape as we do today, as the Ute did, and the many Plains tribes who lived here.
Even though we're removed from that area, it does not really mean that you were cut off totally, because the other part of us is our thinking, our spiritual relationship with land that used to be, is still connected to that thinking part, the spiritual connection.
The land and everything in it, of it, above it, and below it is so essential that our languages and cultures were born from it. Everything is alive, full of spirit, sacred.
You can picture yourself like standing here and looking out. You can hear people in the background or see people moving around, but they're spirit people. The land itself still is the same. It hasn't changed. And in our ceremonial circle, we always say that nothing gets old. It's always the same. Life is like, it's a continuation of now. And that's where the connection is. That's why it's important to us, Native Americans, that you keep the landscape as it is, because it has not yet told its story. It is still there. The sacredness has been here, and it's going to remain here.
Many peoples have known this land, its sounds and feelings familiar to them for countless generations. To these people, there were no lines drawn between them and the natural world in which they lived, Everything was sacred and connected in a web of meaning that will always be part of this land. Now when we walk this same ground, if we know how to look and to listen, we will feel the spirit of the land.
Bringing back the sacredness, or bringing that over here onto this side, one has to move from our side to the center. And in our ceremonies, we always say that if you want to adjust or to connect with the past or with the spirit, you gotta go halfway. Then it will come halfway too. Each time that you move toward it, it'll move towards you. We find that if we go all the way, then it too comes all the way. Then you're there. And that's what we are trying to create. So now we have this place that we're going to use as a place of getting together. Navachuk. Navachuk means together or meeting. Navachuk. Mawisi. Navachuk Mawisi means we are meeting in a center. In our language, we say that.
And that's pretty much all I have to say. It's been a great experience, a great journey for us. We hope to continue working with tribes well into the future, integrating their stories and allowing them to tell their story.
All right, how are conflicting opinions from different tribes or individuals in a tribe resolved or dealt with under the law? It's very specific, I think, to Bridget. Don't be offended if I walk away. I'm looking for cards.
Well, the law requires that those opinions be sought. The law requires that museums seek a dialogue and seek information. And there will be differing opinions. I think that is to be expected. And oftentimes, that's where the other lines of evidence under the law come into place. And something that I'm always reminded of by Sherry Hutt, who just retired as the National NAGPRA director and who was a circuit court judge as well as a PhD in forestry. Amazing lady. She always cautioned in her classes, is there any evidence to the contrary? And so NAGPRA deals with the preponderance of evidence, and that is a weight of evidence. It's not a certainty. It's not a scientific certainty. So it's a level of ambiguity that many of us as scientists are really uncomfortable with because it's a level of certainty that makes us feel a little squirmy in our seats. But preponderance means more likely than not. And so you have to weigh all those lines of available evidence, even when there are times that there's conflicting information. And that almost always happens, in my opinion. It's just a matter of course. I don't know if either of you have anything to add.
Respectful comment that has to do with the repatriation team at the Smithsonian, who I greatly respect the work that they do. You know, it's just like Bridget said so beautifully, it's not always easy. Even when your intention is to serve the communities in the best possible way. You know, for instance, the Northern and the Southern Cheyenne split at one point in time. And some of the individuals that they're interested in, there's a claim from the Northern Cheyenne and the Southern Cheyenne for the same individual because they were together at that time. You know, these aren't, some people think they're claims like, well, museums want to keep everything and the Indians want it back. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. That's not really the world of the way it plays out, I don't think, case by case. And so talking and having discussions, you know, there was a small child who died when the Indians were on the run with the military literally at their heels. And a lot of things were jettisoned and left behind as people had to really tried to move quickly ahead of the military. And so this small child died, was left with a whole lot of belongings that had to be jettisoned. And the military picked it up, scooped it up, took it back. It goes to the Army Medical Museum and eventually comes to the Smithsonian Institution. They were interested in getting that small child back. And we were interested in that going forward in a good way. But how does one work that out? And in this situation, there was a happy circumstance where what they decided to do was create an exhibit. The Cheyenne people said, we'd love to have an exhibit about Cheyenne family values and be able to use all of this material that was a snapshot of a moment in time to teach something that we think is important. And that was how that particular one went forward. So with each instance in which we find the middle ground, it strengthens those conversations into the future. And so I think it was much harder, probably the first year of NAGPRA, than it is this year. It doesn't mean that every case is simpler, but there is being built, these relationships, as these two women are actively on the ground building, a path toward understanding between as worlds collide, because we do come from very different backgrounds.
Thank you.
Well, I wanted to follow up with Peggy's comments because it brought to mind some of the challenges we have faced, especially in the American Southwest. For example, the Bureau of Land Management, Anasazi Heritage Center, had a number of Puebloan remains in its collections that we were required to make determinations of cultural affiliation using all of the available evidence. Now, we had consulted with tribes, and we knew from our consultation with the Navajo Nation that they had asserted cultural affiliation on par with other Pueblos. And ultimately, the Bureau of Land Management made a determination of cultural affiliation for shared group affiliation with the contemporary Pueblo tribes that excluded the Navajo Nation. And that was based on a preponderance of available evidence. And when I was with the Colorado Historical Society, we made a similar finding for Puebloan remains. That said, at any time, tribes can come forward with more evidence. At the Historical Society, we've determined that there was evidence for cultural affiliation with the 21 Pueblo tribes, and that after the Pueblo Revolt, that there had been intermarriage and definitely kinship relationships with those ancient Puebloan remains, but that wasn't the same line of descendancy. And these are the slippery slopes that we must navigate on a regular basis. It's not easy, and you can't make everybody happy. You just have to follow the law. The spirit of the law is one thing. I actually look at the letters and go, okay, yeah, this is what it says. Because at the end of the day, if my museum goes to court, I have to be able to have a defensible decision that we can present.
Thank you. We have some specific questions about the law. So does NAGPRA apply to private collections?
NAGPRA applies to any organization that has received federal funds. So for example, in my hometown of Deming, New Mexico, the Luna County Historical Society runs a lovely little museum that they insist they don't need to comply with NAGPRA because it's a volunteer-run museum. However, they do get funds from the county, and the county gets funds from the federal government, and therefore, my beloved little Luna County Museum is subject to the provisions of NAGPRA. However, NAGPRA does not apply to private collections except in the case of human remains. Those remains are covered under state statutes in different states unless you try to sell them, and then it becomes a federal trafficking offense. So I hope, does that answer your question?
It does. You might think people don't have human remains in their homes, but let me assure you they do. When I was at the National Museum of Natural History, it was a fairly common phone call. I was just going through my grandparents' attic. They've passed away, and I have found a skull. It happens. Next part of the question. What about private collections obtained from museums? Which I will jump in and say this does happen. Occasionally museums will deaccession artifacts. It is our job to bring in artifacts that support our museum. We do a process called accessioning them. But occasionally museums, and you will read about this in the paper sometimes, I think a car museum in Los Angeles not too long ago deaccessioned and sold. They'll deaccession artifacts that they feel maybe don't support the museum's mission. And it's a way to raise funds. So it's possible that someone could buy collections from a museum. So what would happen in that case with NAGPRA?
Museums used to wheel and deal all the time. I've gone through the collection, the archives at the Denver Art Museum, the Denver Museum of Natural History, the Colorado, the State Museum, and people were trading collections like frickin' baseball cards. And the Denver Art Museum in the 70s decided that it was going to have garage sales where they unloaded a lot of their American Indian art. So it would not be inconceivable to me that folks would have bought collections like that from a museum. But remember earlier I said that NAGPRA is also property law. So you always have to follow the chain where the collections originated. If it's before 1990 and a museum is selling collections in good faith to a buyer who bought them in good faith, that person would not be held liable. However, there could be provisions where the museum could be held responsible for selling such collections, especially after 1990. That could, and in fact, it has happened since 1990, and museums have been prosecuted for selling such collections without first consulting with tribes. Isn't that the Penn collection came up a couple years ago? So it does happen.
And a third part to this question, does NAGPRA apply to objects that are potentially stolen, either a museum or private collection?
Absolutely. That's where the property law comes in. And even at the turn of the century, there were lots of objects that were sold by American Indians. Times were tough. People were literally starving. And a lot of items were sold that that individual maybe never had the right to sell in the first place. The property law aspects there would apply. If they're stolen and comply with all of the other aspects of the law, then whoever is holding the bag or the artifact in this case is left accountable.
Well, that's a hard thing for museums. It's that good faith transaction. Museums are dedicating staff resources, people, money, resources, and space resources to maintain objects that aren't theirs to be maintaining. So this has happened. So we have a couple of other questions here that I think are more for the archaeologists we had up earlier. So I might hang on to these and get to them at the keynote tonight. Just the three of you. I had a chance to share my story about a moment during a NAGPRA process that was very meaningful for me. Would any of the three of you have something that was pretty significant in your experience that you wouldn't mind sharing with the group?
I think those moments happen all the time. And if you are listening, you're going to be hearing things that you didn't expect to hear. And it's almost impossible to describe those interactions, but they are very meaningful, and they do strengthen our relationships. I think that for museums, NAGPRA was really scary. You know, they were worried that they were going to lose all of their collections and that we weren't going to be able to retain, intellectual knowledge of these artifacts and this history. And as, the conveyors of the history, it was a vulnerable place. And so I think for me personally, it was really just feeling completely out of my element, but being able to approach it with an open heart and an open mind, and being willing to listen and make informed decisions really allowed me to grow as a professional, and have been able to carry that through with other interactions that I have with those other groups that are so important to our history as well. There's always lots of tidbits of fun history, like the time we were having breakfast in upstairs of the museum, and elders had to use the restroom in the basement, and the elevator got stuck. Or the technology failed when we were trying to write the agreement for the 11 tribes, and we had, I think Bridget was on one computer, and we had a couple other people writing, and all three of the computers failed at the same time, and the Xerox machines wouldn't work. Just crazy stuff happened in the chaos of the consultations and the events, and you have to roll with it. It's pretty special.
One of the stories I can share from Colorado that moved me quite a bit was early on when an archaeologist, Patty Walker Buchanan, knew of my interest in learning more, and so she was going to do a consultation with individuals who've become friends of mine, Alden Naranjo down at Ignacio, and through him met his mother and uncle and whatnot. But anyway, they were coming together for an all-Ute powwow. I think it was the second one that they had done, and they were in Glenwood Springs. So I flew out from Washington, D.C. to go with them, and to visit a ochre cave on the river toward the east entrance of the river canyon that heads from the east to Glenwood Springs. And so we went out there, and all manner of things happened. I remember I met a man named Austin Benbox, and we were walking together along the railroad track. And he started talking to me about my grandfather being a policeman. And it always takes my breath away when people, their ability to know things, when they haven't been told by me. It's the beginning of my going deeper with how things work in the spiritual world. And so anyway, my head was sort of spinning long before we got there. But the beauty of it was that it was Alden's brother, Raymond, who has since passed away, had cancer at that time. And that cave had been used probably for thousands of years. And one of the uses of that cave was to go there for healing and certain ceremonies that would be conducted in such a place. And so not only were we going there for us to learn something about that, but it was a very practical occasion where Raymond was being taken there for a healing ceremony, which really wasn't spoken of till we got there. I didn't know that. His wife and his child were there, and Austin Benbox and a whole group of Ute people who loved and cared for Raymond were all at the cave. And so the ceremony began, and I wasn't sure how to conduct myself at such a private moment, and I felt like the best thing to do would be to go off to the side and sit quietly with Patty to give them space and privacy for that, which I did. And then after, they were so dear, and you could hear the singing and the various things, and they came and got us and were very generous, and there's rock art all outside the cave, and they took us into this big cavernous space where you had beautiful red ochre ledge, and underneath it beautiful yellow ochre. It just took my breath away in the beautiful canyon to begin with, and spoke about the caretakers of that place, and there were hot springs and warm springs and people who lived there. And Bertha Grove had come out previously, and of course, who's a spiritual elder, and she can still see things. She can see the offerings that hang in trees. So when you're with them, they have the capacity that humans have. We all have portions of those capacities. It's like any muscle you might have that you use that grows stronger with use, right? So I remember how precious that was and how generous they were to allow me to be amongst them for that. And it was sort of the beginning of many things that happened with Alden as we continued to walk down that space. And so I just wanted to share that and thank Alden. He's not here, but he is alive, and Bertha's probably listening going, that's my son, Junior, as she called him, my firstborn.
I would just like to add how incredibly humbled I've been to be able to have the experiences I've had with the people. And one thing that strikes me a lot is, as an archaeologist, there are lots of female archaeologists, but I've worked almost in an entirely male-dominated little microcosm during my career. And most of the delegates that we work with, most of the NAGPRA representatives are male. However, over the years, I really struck a chord with a lot of the grandmas. There are these incredibly strong women who just carry, they're carrying their tribe's essence with them every day. They're making sure that they're raising the next generation or their own grandchildren. And we were having a large multi-tribal consultation in the 90s, and Zona Lone Zero, who was standing Rock Sioux, we were looking at these beaded bags, and the front of the beaded bag had a Northern Plains floral pattern on it, and the back had the classical, geometric Sioux pattern. And the women just started cackling hysterically, and it was a man's medicine bag, and I said, "What is so funny?" And she said, "Well, on the front, you can tell that this is the man's tribe. The woman's like, okay, I'm going to bead you a bag. This is who you are." But on the back, she's saying, "But I never forgot where I came from." And so just this sense of cultural continuity, and talking with Charlotte Lumpmouth from the Northern Cheyenne, she was looking at moccasins in our collection. She goes, "Oh yeah, I recognize that. That's, I think, my great-grandauntie's." And I was like, "Sure, yeah, right, sure." She's like, "No, really." She brings out a sampler of bead designs that is over 100 years old. Those are bead designs that are specific to her family, that she's able to recognize her family's bead designs in our collection. So I knew with Charlotte that these women are no dummies. They're very knowledgeable, and I was younger then, and after a few days together, I knew as an anthropologist that I had broken some ground when Charlotte looked at me and she said, "Are you sure you're not Native American? You sure you're not Indian?" I said, "No, I'm not." She's like, "No, I think you have some in you." So.
I seem to recall hearing a story about a dress in our collection. Correct me if I'm wrong, Cheryl. I think we got this dress and for years fawned over this beautiful dress, and then had some consultant work done with natives coming in. And do you want to? Well, I don't think I'm going to tell it right. I'm pretty sure they came in and said, "You guys have been fooling yourselves." It wasn't what we thought it was. And it took talking to natives 70 years after the fact to learn that this is a throwaway dress that someone sold on the side of the road, and that ain't beautiful beadwork. You guys don't know from beautiful beadwork, as I recall.
Yeah, that was the Soldier Wolf family that came in and corrected us on that behavior. But, what we did find out about our museum collection is that, we don't have anything that's really that special. And that's okay. It tells our story. We have a lot of things that were made by natives for the Frank Miller Wild West show. And so they were made to be costumes. And so that's part of our story. And here we were thinking we had all these great things, and really, they're great. They tell a great story, which is not the story we thought they were going to tell.
Another one story that comes from the Smithsonian. And I'd been working with Nangak for a period of time, and he was a working and trained and from childhood shaman. But in Greenland, when the missionaries came in, as happened in so many places, they forbid certain ceremonies, like the ghost dance and the massacre that happened with that. And it happened all over the world. And in Greenland, one of the ways it was expressed is that the shaman were not allowed to go through their final ceremonies up on the mountain. They tried to stomp that out, and if you did do it, there would be severe consequences for the family, and they watched families that, of course, had hereditary lines. So Anangak was a shaman and had been a shaman for quite a long time. When the elders approached him in Greenland and said, that's enough of that, we're reclaiming our rights. And so we want someone to go up on the mountain and be the person to go through the ceremonies the first time in 140 years. And it was one of his relatives who was the last time. So he was chosen to do that. And there was a process that lasted a year of preparation and formalities around that. And as it was becoming close, he came to the Smithsonian for other things. And he asked me to set certain things up for him. And one of them was, I thought he would enjoy seeing the collections from Greenland that are held in the repository of the American Indian Museum. So we went over there, and there was a poignant moment where we all knew that he was about to go through the ceremonies on the mountain in Greenland at this historic moment in time. And one of the top doors, he's up on a ladder, was a shaman's drum. That's probably, I don't know, probably 700-800 years old, maybe. Much smaller because they're using driftwood. Precious drum with a rawhide, top, very fragile. And so he's climbing up on the ladder, and Dennis was with us for that. And just the moment when there was just silence in the room, where you see this man knowing all the import, much more than I would actually know, what it was going to be for him to go up on the mountain holding this drum from this man before. And those are the things that can happen when there are material objects from the past that bring it back to life. And he was holding it, and Dennis said the same thing. It is really true, the top of the drum vibrated, and nobody was moving, and the drum herself was communicating. And to be there in those moments is precious. And, funny moments too, because there was a whaler's, tool, the Aboriginal tool for whaling. And normally you wear gloves, and you have to be very careful. There's a cement floor in there. And Anangak picks it up, and he's so excited because he was raised as a hunter, and he's like, whoa, and he gets so excited. And he picks it up, and he's above the cement floor, like showing us how it was used, And I was looking over at Terry Snowball, who's in charge of those collections, as a native person himself, because as the person who brought him in, that makes me sort of responsible for what comes down instead of him having to be the heavy, right? So I'm looking it over at him, but Anangak's my elder, so I was sort of like, I know we don't do this around here, but, I don't want to tell Anangak no. So I looked at Terry to see, and he's kind of like, with just eye language, it's okay. For Anangak, it's okay. It's just sweet things that you're privileged to be privileged to, and with our own elders. I might tell a story about George Frisman. He's in the back of the room. Don't embarrass somebody. I love this guy. So, one time we were at the Iwo Jima Memorial. I never knew that Doc had been there during that battle in the war. I'd known him for years, but I didn't know that. I knew he was in the Navy. And he begins to speak of personal experience of having been there that day, and it's so we have our elders as well. And it's a privileged moment to be able to learn from someone you greatly respect who has personal experience that will enrich your life. And so, Doc Sierens, I just wanted to say publicly, just thank you for everything, all the stories that you have shared with us.
I'm going to piggyback on that one real quick, because when I came from D.C. to the museum, probably 2 weeks after I'd been there, you and Dennis were in the basement with, I think Bridget was there as well with the baby. And I just was not getting it. I was like, what is so special about these damn rocks? And I just kind of kept, I kept saying that. I'm like, I'm a material culture girl. I don't know, what's so special about these things. And finally, at the time, Dennis was much more burlier, grabbed a hold of my hand and stuck a side scraper in my hand. I don't remember if you remember this. And it was that moment that I got it. It was like somebody 12,000 years ago made this tool, and it fits my hand today. So absolutely, we can learn from all sorts of elders, and that's a story that I tell my students, people who want to learn about the collection. That was one of the most special moments I've ever had.
And I agree with what both of these incredibly smart ladies have said. I think working with tribes, especially as non-Indians, we see this as, it's a little scary, a little unfamiliar, but I grew up in small towns, and I was raised mostly by my grandparents, so I really love old people. And working with tribes, working with elders, I think because I come from a rural background and am really familiar and reverent towards people who know a lot more than I do, it's helped me to see that not only with tribal partners, but just as these ladies have said, with our revered elders from so many walks of life.
The elder I had to work the hardest with, tough nut to crack, was Doris Greenacre. Any of you guys, that's Jim Greenacre's wife. She was still alive and a volunteer at the museum when we started there. Man, I was too young to know history. I think I was 24, 25 when I started there. So how could someone that old have any appreciation for history? And I was not from Fort Collins. It took a long time to earn her trust. God rest her soul. Thank you.